Dumb Hippie, and here are the news stories big in national news this past decade. On June 5, 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Senator Kennedy had been running for presidency at the time of his death. Kennedy's is the fifth notable murder to occur this decade. Others murdered this decade include Ngo Dinh Diem, President of Vietnam, assassinated in 1963, Kennedy's brother John, assassinated during his presidency in 1963, Civil rights leader Malcolm X, assassinated in 1965, George Rockwell, leader of the American Nazi Party, assassinated in 1967, and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated in 1968. On April 30th, President Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia, continuing our involvement in the Vietnam War. On May 1st, riots broke out at Kent State University in reaction to Nixon's order. During the riots, bonfires filled the streets, a copy of the Constitution was burned, and Leroy Satrum, mayor of Kent, Ohio, declared a state of emergency. On May 2nd, the National Guard was called in, and the Reserve Officer Training Corps building was burned to the ground. On May 3rd, more riots broke out, and on May 4th, 4 students were shot and killed, and 9 were wounded by the National Guard. Truly a sad day for America. Anyway, it's 4:20 and I have a dentist appointment.
Welcome to your local station's affiliate World News Station. Today is our Decade in Review special for the 1960s. I'm your host, Ron Burgundy. On June 10th, 1968, one of the world's most prominent civil rights activists was shot and killed. Martin Luther King Jr. was standing outside of his hotel room when he was shot by James Earl Ray. Due to Ray's racist tendencies and fanaticism, a plan was carried out to assassinate Martin Luther King Jr. However, major controversy erupted when James Earl Ray confessed to murdering MLK. Until they denied it. Thus, conspiracies were born. In one of our other major world news, the Australian and New Zealand armed forces attacked Bimba, a small farming and plantation village in Vietnam. They were met with some intense fighting, as this was an intense close-quarters battle with the Viet Cong forces. What was the need to fight in this tiny village in the June of 1969, however? A Centurion tank was passing by the village on the route where enemy encounters seemed unlikely. Sadly, the unlikely likely happened, and the RPG struck the tank. This was struck to 2-day skirmish. Well, that's all for now. Happy 1970, everyone!
Stay classy, San Diego.
Stay classy, San Diego. Dang it. Duh!
Hello, I'm here with New York's local news station, and this is the Decade in Review. Well, we're gonna start off with the counterculture in Woodstock. Woodstock was a giant music festival that lasted 3 days, which was August 15th through 19th on 1969. It was hosted at Max Yasgur's farm in Bethel, New York. Some of the famous musicians that were there were the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker, Santana, and The Who.
Who?
Yes. It was a giant music festival, as previously said. There were 400,000 people there, but only 186 tickets sold, so there was a lot of money lost. Also, it was, just sum it all up, there were a lot of naked hippies who were all stoned. After that, there was a movie made by Michael Wadley that documented what happened. It was a documentary, and it documented. It was made in 1970, and it had all the musicians in it that were interviewed, and they were played by themselves. Plus, it had producers, promoters, and other important people. The movie itself grossed about $50 million, which I guess was kind of made up for the loss of money of the actual festival itself. Moving on. Civil rights in New York. That was pretty important. So, there was stuff like the Montgomery bus boycott, and Alabama, and sit-ins, and civil rights acts. So pretty much, there were a bunch of black people who wanted more rights, so they sat in places and waited till those laws were changed. So, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin, which race includes black people, in employment practices and public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 restored and protected voting rights. Immigration and Nationality Services Act of 1965 dramatically opened entry to the U.S. to immigrants other than traditional European groups, which means people from not America or Europe. Right. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 banned discrimination in the sale or renting of housing. There were also civil rights groups such as the NAACP, SNCC, CORE, and SCLC, which the NAACP was National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE was the Congress of Racial Equality, and SCLC was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So, they did stuff like sit-ins, marches, protests, speeches, and wrote letters. And they had one specific protest that related to New York, which was called the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work protests. And that was hosted in Chicago, New York, D.C., and that's just to name a few. One of the most important was Malcolm X. He was a famous dude. And he supported a citywide boycott of New York public schools. So, in summary there, all the African Americans wanted more rights, so they protested. And then they got it. Yeah. Later.
Art of the 1960s has been about being abstract. Artists try to have viewers see their own interpretation of the art, rather than telling them exactly what they should see. Optical illusions, like paintings by the artist Vasarely, pictured here, have also abounded. Literature, unlike art, gave us a clear vision of the 60s. To Kill a Mockingbird, which was published during this most recent decade, along with many others about the evils of racism. With numerous books about racism, it can be expected that feminists also brought up protests in books, like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Along with these great pieces of literature, television grew more and more important in culture, possibly because of Americans seeing the significance of it in the Kennedy-Nixon debate during the 1960 election. On September 26, 1960, Kennedy and Nixon held the first televised presidential debate. Over 70 million Americans watched it, showing how big television was about to become. Television also allowed viewers to see the Vietnam War like war had not been viewed before. Also, without television, you couldn't be watching this. I'm Bruce Nolan, and that's the way the cookie crumbles.
Exit out and press the start button again. I'm gonna go poop.
We're gonna keep that on the bloopers.
Let you down. Desert you.
That's enough.
Hi, Charlie.
I love you.